My Lords, the whole House is indebted to the noble Baroness Lady Featherstone for initiating today's important debate. During her remarks, she referred to the consequences of indebtedness on development, a point taken up by the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Sheffield. 40 years ago, on the 22nd of November 1984, in the House of Commons, I challenged the then government and its policy on Ethiopia, stressing that Ethiopia was still paying back more in debt than it was receiving in aid. And as the noble Baroness also rightly remarked, in comments that were echoed very movingly, I thought, by her noble friend Lord Oates, the catastrophe in Ethiopia was brought into our homes by the extraordinary journalism of the BBC's Michael Burke, whose devastating first-hand accounts aroused our consciences and our indignation, a point I want to return to in my comments today. I want to particularly follow what the noble Lord Browne of Ladyton said to us and roll the clock forward to the 2 years of war in Tigray between 2020 and 2022 and the situation there now. Professor Nyssen of Ghent University, a leading European authority on the war, has put the number of war fatalities at between 300,000 and 500,000 people, including 50,000 to 100,000 from fighting, 150,000 to 200,000 due to famine, and 100,000 from lack of medical attention. Be clear, my lords, this was man-made, but no men have been brought to justice. Professor Alex de Waal, the Executive Director of World Peace Foundation, draws parallels with the catastrophic situation in 1984. He says, in 1984, the Ethiopian government wanted the world to believe that its revolution heralded a bright new era of prosperity, and foreign donors refused to believe warnings of starvation until they saw pictures of dying children on the BBC News. Now, on Tuesday evening, while speaking here at a meeting held in the palace, I was struck by the intervention of a Tigrayan who believed it was a complete denial of media access to the region during 2020 and 2022, which has enabled the regime to repeat these unspeakable acts of horror, these atrocities. That meeting was held to discuss the report of the New Lines Institute, undertaken over 2 years and comprising some 100,000 words. It concludes that the crime of genocide has occurred in Tigray. I have a copy for the noble Lord the Minister, and I will give it to Lord Collins during the course of the debate. He will know, I think he has seen it, that this has echoes from 1984. Ethiopia, as we heard from the noble Lord Oates, was then ruled by the Marxist-Leninist pro-Soviet Derg, ending in 1991 when its leader, Mengistu, was fled to Zimbabwe. The House should also note that an Ethiopian court found him guilty of genocide in absentia. His regime was estimated to be responsible for the deaths of 500,000 to 2 million Ethiopians, mostly during the famine. Of course, he's never been brought to justice, becoming a role model for others who commit atrocities with impunity. In September 2023, I chaired a cross-party inquiry which published a report entitled "The Three Horsemen of the War in Tigray: Mass Killings, Sexual Violence and Starvation." It called upon the UK government and other actors to provide a response commensurate with the gravity and the scale of what had occurred. It made clear that starvation in Tigray is not an unintended consequence of the conflict, but, as we heard from the noble Baroness Lady Herrick, a method of war. That finding is underlined in the New Lines inquiry, which concludes that there was, I quote, an intent to destroy Tigrayans as an ethnic group in whole or in part. This is one of the criteria for the crime of genocide, fueled by torture, rape, mutilation and sexual violence. Another criterion is that the prevention of birth is one of those factors that is taken into account when declaring a genocide, is illustrated by the slogan that, and I quote, "The Tigrayan womb should never give birth." In October 2021, Mark Lowcock, the United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator, commented on the situation in Tigray, including the attempt to block aid from going into the region. These are his words. There's not just an attempt to starve 6 million people, but an attempt to cover up what's going on. What we're seeing play out, I think, is potentially the worst famine in the world in the 21st century. What's happening is that Ethiopian authorities are running a sophisticated campaign to stop aid from getting in by, for example, making it impossible for truck drivers to operate, by setting up checkpoints with officials and militia people, by preventing fuel from getting in. And what they're trying to do is to starve the population of Tigray into subjugation or out of existence, but to avoid the opprobrium that would still be associated with a deliberate, successful attempt to create a famine taking the lives of millions of people. And in 2021, Pekka Haavisto, Finland's foreign minister and a European Union special envoy to Ethiopia, said that following his talks with Prime Minister Abiy and other ministers, he believed that they were, his words, going to wipe out the Tigrayans for 100 years. Now, in response to our cross-party inquiry, Tigrayan Advocacy and Development Association told us this: the Ethiopian, Eritrean and Amhara forces left a trail of scorched earth in which they deliberately burned houses, forests and field crops ready for harvest, cut mango orchards, papaya trees and plant nurseries, mixed grains with soil, looted and slaughtered livestock, and killed hundreds of protected wild animals. To ensure no harvest for the next season, ENDF, EDF, AS and Fano militia worked in tandem to block vital agricultural supplies, including seeds, destroyed and looted farm tools, and prevented farmers from tilling their land during the most crucial period. My Lords, Martin Griffiths, the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, reported that at the height of the crisis, 100 trucks a day of aid needed to get to Tigray, but only 10% had gained access in the previous 3 months. New Lines highlights the shooting of truck drivers and the arrest and detention of drivers before they reach Tigray as another way of preventing food from getting through. The restrictions of aid continued after the ceasefire and during the informal truce, although WFP and OCHA reported a resumption of aid deliveries at the beginning of April 2022. In reality, while they estimated that 115 food trucks would be needed every day throughout May, convoys were only able to bring supplies into Tigray on 6 occasions. Which brings us to today, my lords. In February 2024, Tigray officials warned of an unfolding famine that could equal or eclipse the 1984 famine. Ethiopia's ombudsman said it had confirmed the starvation deaths of at least 351 people in Tigray and another 21 in the neighbouring Amhara region as a result of drought and instability. And once again, the scale of this tragedy, like that in Sudan, as we've heard, has been massively underreported. In February, The Guardian reported, and I quote, that humanitarians have mostly kept quiet, fearful of losing their operating licences. They went on to say, in private, however, their language is stark. A recent memo circulated among aid agencies warns that starvation and death are inevitable in considerable numbers from March onwards in some areas of Tigray if aid doesn't reach them soon. Another says child malnutrition rates, a point emphasised, of course, by the Noble Lady Featherstone earlier on and others in the debate, the role that malnutrition can play in terms of long-term development. Malnutrition rates are as high as 47% in parts of Oromia, Ethiopia's biggest region. On July the 30th, I asked the Minister to comment on reports that more than 2 million were reported to be at risk of starvation in Tigray, and he responded that the humanitarian community is targeting 3.8 million people with food assistance. I was pleased to hear that the UK is leading a pledging conference, and I echo the question asked by the Noble Baroness Lady Ainley as to how much of the $610 million has actually been raised and deployed. But I end by asking again once more the question, what is being done to bring those responsible to justice? I hope, like the Noble Lord Oates and the Noble Lord Browne, that in another 40 years there will not be a similar parliamentary debate asking why those with political power in 2024 did no better than those who went before them.